I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which we join today across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, and Maori people with us today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on improving road safety through data-driven insights. For those who may not know me, I'm Amir Safhani. I'm the Director of Safe Path Consulting and a committee member of Australasian College of Road Safety Victorian Chapter. And I'm very pleased to be facilitating this important webinar today. We are very delighted to have such a strong audience from across government, industry, and academia, all committed to making roads safer. And today, we are privileged to hear from 4 outstanding speakers who bring diverse expertise and perspectives on this important conversation. To officially open the session and provide a welcome on behalf of Australasian College of Road Safety Victorian Chapter, I'd now like to hand over to Ms. Chris Harrison, who is the chair of Victorian Chapter of the college, to provide the welcome address to the audience. Chris, hand it over to you.
Thanks, Amir, and thanks for everyone being here. It was great to see such strong wanting to be involved in this webinar. And I guess last year we held a data webinar that was very well attended as well, with many asking for a second show. So to see so many registered for this shows a real interest in data. So thank you for coming along, and thank you, Amir, for bringing such great speakers to the table, which Amir will introduce more as we go. And just to begin, I would like to acknowledge those impacted by road trauma, those that have been harmed, those who have caused harm, their families, first responders and communities, and really recognise the pain, the strength and the ongoing journeys that are carried into this space. And I think this is something that really brings us all together in looking at how we can prevent what we're seeing on the roads and the road trauma, the people that are killed and seriously injured on our roads, because we know it impacts so many across our communities. And also with the Australasian College of Road Safety, the Victorian chapter, and I know we've got people from lots of other chapters and international that are attending today's webinar, but really, you know, get involved in your regional chapters and your state chapters, international chapters and networks, because it really is a peak body that gives us an opportunity to really have a voice across the Australasian and international space, and, you know, being able to really advocate and look at areas that we can improve in the road safety space is really good. And it brings so many people, you know, from research to practitioners in lots of different aspects. So we do encourage you to get involved. If you're not a member, to become a member and, you know, share that voice with many to be able to do what we do. So thank you. And I'll probably leave it there, I think, Amir.
Thank you, Chris, for that welcome address. And what I would like to do now, I would like to go through some the housekeeping points to just consider here. So the webinar will be 120 minutes. Please keep your microphone on mute unless you raise your hand to ask a question. We will have the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So we will not have Q&A at the end of each presentation. So at the end of the webinar, we will have the allocated at least 30 minutes in order to do the discussions and questions and answers. So please keep your microphone on mute. If you have any feedback or any question, you can just put that in the chat box, and the presenters will do their best to just, you know, address your questions or just be involved with the discussions. When it goes to the question and answer time, for sure the priority goes to the people who raise their hand, and because we would like this webinar to be an interactive webinar. And so we would just value people just raising their hands and just asking their questions, and the panel will respond, or just start a discussion on the topic. So I think that's about it. And as I mentioned, we have 4 very, very well-known presenters today. So I just make my sort of talking very short and go to the first presenter, who is Dr. Blair Turner. So let me introduce the first presenter. Dr. Blair Turner is going to talk about data-driven insights, international perspectives. Dr. Blair Turner has been involved in road safety for 30 years, working and providing advice on the topic in the more than 40 countries. Most recently, he worked as a road safety specialist for the Global Road Safety Facility at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the bank, he led research as the Australian Road Research Board, ARB, as chief scientist for road safety. Now based in Australia, he provides consulting services to clients throughout Australia and internationally. Blair has spent much of his career in conducting applied research on road safety, including addressing road safety risks through use of data. He was a contributor to WHO Road Safety Manual on Data Systems, and also for the World Bank Guide on conducting road safety data reviews. He has established crash data systems in several countries and trained government agencies and practitioners in the collection and use of this data to effectively manage road safety outcomes. I would like to hand it over to you, Blair, to start your presentation, please.
Great. Thanks, Amir. I'll just, if you stop sharing your screen. Okay. Hopefully you can see that screen now. So yeah, I want to take I guess a high-level view around the use of data to help us in managing road safety outcomes. So I'll talk about some of the different uses for road safety data, and then the sorts of data that's actually implied by those uses. I'll touch briefly on a bit of work we've done at the World Bank on assessing your situation and doing data reviews. And then I'll end up with a couple of slides on some of the emerging data sources. So the presentation material comes from several sources. So a few of the international projects I've been involved in. So yeah, the World Health Organization manual on the left, the green one there, the data systems manual, is still very relevant and available. Top right is the online resource, the PIAC's, the World Road Association Road Safety Manual, and a chapter we prepared in that on the use of safety data. So I'll try and put the link to that in the chat a bit later. And then lastly, I'll touch on the new guidance from the World Bank about road safety data reviews. Much of this is fairly obvious and perhaps a bit of a reminder. So lots of different uses for road safety data, identifying the scale of the problem and developing a business case to actually do something about that. We need it to effectively manage road safety using a results focus, and I'll spend a bit of time talking about that in this presentation, and for an evidence-based approach. And from a practical perspective, that involves using data to develop strategies, track our performance, identifying risks and analysing those risks, and using that to actually then identify the most cost-effective treatments or interventions, but also for evaluation of outcomes. So lots of different purposes for road safety data. This slide here comes from a colleague in ex-New Zealand Police, so Al Stewart, who's now with the Global Road Safety Partnership in Geneva. And I think it demonstrates really well why we need more than just crash data. So this is from New Zealand, one district, and this line shows on a quarterly basis the number of speed-related crashes occurring over time. And you can see this figure jumps all over the place, up and down. And often we'll be asked, why have crashes gone up or gone down? And if you're only dealing with the crash data, that's often very hard to understand. What's, I think, quite useful, what Al has done here is he's actually layered another data element across this time series. And this is quite simplistic, but it kind of shows the principle of what we need to be doing. The blue line shows the amount of enforcement for speed, so that the proxy measure here of the amount of speed notices issued. And you can see basically it's a mirror image. As the number of amount of enforcement increases for speed, the speed-related crashes reduce. And look, it's not a perfect mirror. There's other things that obviously happen at the same time, but this, I think, shows quite clearly the value of using and combining different sources of data to help us understand our problem, but also to help us understand the impact of what we're actually doing in terms of interventions as well. This diagram's probably familiar to many. I think it's one of the most important diagrams in road safety, but it's also one of the least well understood. We do cover this in this PARC Road Safety Manual. The online resource, Chapter 5, covers this framework and how the data fits into it. So certainly recommend you actually spend time to understand this process, because it really is fundamental to all we do in road safety. Whether you're in state government, local government, police, road agencies, whatever your role, it's important to understand that road safety needs to be produced. Just like any other good or service, we don't just let things happen. We need to actually manage what we're doing, and it's called this results-based approach in road safety. In simple terms, at the bottom level, we have these institutional management functions, things like funding, promotion, coordination, research, and that leads to the interventions we use in road safety. The top of this pyramid, though, shows the data requirements around that, and it is very complex. So let me just show this in a different way, just to kind of show you, perhaps more simplistically, a sort of a typical policy cycle. So you might identify a problem, develop a policy to address that problem, deliver that policy, monitor what you're doing, and then assess the outcomes, and then it sort of loops back around again. So in road safety, that might be that you've got a speed-related problem. All of us have that. And it might be that based on evidence, the policy would be to increase speed enforcement, perhaps amongst other measures as well. This is the critical part, though. What we're not doing well globally is actually monitoring our indicators, particularly our process and implementation indicators. The policy might be to increase speed enforcement, but are we actually doing that? How many hours of additional enforcement are being undertaken, and where and how? So that's a data need that's often missing in our frameworks. And then from that, would gather information about what's the immediate impact, what's the performance in terms of the behavioural response to that. So what is, for instance, the change in speeds? What is the perception of road users about whether they'll be caught speeding or not? And then it's only downstream, perhaps 2-3 years later, that would actually understand the real impact in terms of the change in crashes. Okay, so that's the sort of the simplistic view. Back to our framework again. So we've got there the outputs, which are those process or implementation indicators, hours of enforcement. It might be the number of traffic calming features or speed limit change that you make. You've then got the intermediate outcomes, and that might be the average speeds, like in this graphic here, which shows over time average speeds reducing from above 100 down to around 100, below 100, which is good compliance. So essentially that's the immediate impact from the change, or it might be you're measuring things like community support and other things as well. And then finally, there is what we probably think of most readily, that is the final outcomes, and that's the crash numbers. So whether that's from police or hospital data, or preferably both of those things combined. Okay, so that's my key point in this presentation. We can't rely on road safety and just crash data alone. We need to have quite a few different sources of data, all informing our processes, our risk assessment, and our identification of solutions. We need crash data, we need traffic data, including motorised traffic use, but also pedestrians and cyclists. Road inventory data, so what are the measures like the number of barriers we're using or traffic calming, etc. We need compliance data, vehicle data, so the average age of the vehicle fleet, for instance, attitude survey data, and there's others as well. So ambulance response times might be another one as well. So a lot of different sources of data, and that's obviously got cost implications, especially for smaller road agencies or local government. And so this needs a bit of thinking, this needs a bit of strategy to actually prioritise what you need to manage your road safety outcomes most effectively. The way we stitch all this together and use this data in a coordinated way is through strategy. Many of you will have seen this diagram before from Sweden. Essentially, they set targets not only for those final outcomes, the change in fatal and serious injury, but also for those intermediate measures as well. And so essentially, at the start of the strategy, they know the current status. They have a target that's set for the end of the strategy. And then every year, they're monitoring the progress against each of those elements. So for instance, in speed, we know that speed has an impact on safety outcomes, on those fatal and serious injuries. And they have, in this case, 2 performance measures, one for the speed on the national high-speed network and one for speeds on the local road network. And you can see here, at this snapshot in time, they weren't tracking where they wanted to be. So that means that you then need to do more. You need to actually invest more or work smarter in terms of your work around that particular target. And really critically, what's missing in many countries, including Australia, is a formal process to review every year in a full and transparent way, and to bring all stakeholders along to actually understand where the gaps lie and to allocate tasks moving forward. So there's a gap for us to work on in many countries on that front. So look, it's very expensive to gather data. We need to do this in a coordinated way. So to help along this path at the World Bank, we developed a guidance document initially intended for use in low and middle income countries, but also useful, I think, for people in Australia. And really it sets out how to review what you're doing based on good international practice. How do you prepare for this review? And it provides some tools to actually assess your current processes. And importantly, it covers the whole data collection process from collection through to analysis and use. And it focuses obviously beyond just the crash data. We've done this process now in quite a few countries, and this is one example from Africa. But I looked at this set of recommendations and I thought actually much of this is actually quite applicable here in Australia as well, in various states. And I'm not necessarily saying in Victoria, but more generally in Australia. So in Africa, and perhaps in some places in Australia, we lack the well-defined institutional arrangements and mechanisms for data collection and management. We need to improve that collection process. Underreporting an issue. There's a need to take a better approach to the analysis that we undertake. There are often multiple sources of data and different databases, and there's a need to actually link those better. And I think Stuart might touch on this a little bit later as well. We need to upskill our staff as well. So a lot of people in these roles perhaps don't appreciate the big picture here and what we're doing and why. And then lastly, those safety performance indicators, we're collecting some, but not really in a coordinated way. So again, lots of different types of data and costs often attached. The good news is we're getting some new approaches and some, I guess, some more cost-effective ways to capture this data and to use it. And some of these you would have heard of already previously, and I think maybe Ross is going to touch on some of the vehicle telematics data a bit later. So this is our in-vehicle data, either from phones or from in-vehicle equipment, that can help us measure our speeds and sometimes traffic use across the network. Maybe it can also help us determine locations where there's been harsh braking or acceleration. And it can even tell us things like the road environment or the weather conditions. So are the windscreen wipers on or not? So we can actually download this information across whole networks and use that to analyze, help us analyze our risks. Event data recorders. So this is the black box from the airplane context now in more modern vehicles, and that's been used extensively in some states as well now. AI RAP, so the road assessment program is using artificial intelligence to interrogate video data, or in this top image here, this is point cloud data from laser scanners. and we can automatically identify around 30 different road elements already based on this artificial intelligence process. So these are elements in the road environment that actually have an influence on safety outcomes. It can also recognise different road user groups as well. And then lastly, this comes from Africa, this bottom image in Nairobi, where very, very low reporting rates for even fatal crash outcomes. And so we scraped data from Twitter and used data from Waze to supplement the police data that was being collected. And that gave us a lot better idea about where crashes were actually occurring. Less detail about the causes, but knowing the locations is actually very, very useful. And just one more example from overseas, we used some data from satellite imagery. So when you get a satellite image, there's actually different spectrums of light there. And there's about a third of a second, well, in fact, exactly 0.35 of a second difference between the first and last frame of that data. And so vehicles will move in that period. And we can actually reasonably accurately measure the speed of vehicles based on satellite imagery. And some correlation work we had the consultants do from the UK showed reasonable levels of validity with that data. And so we used that in Kenya and Ethiopia to give them a picture of their speeds across large parts of their road network. So just to wrap up, I just want to mention again that keep in mind that crash data is vitally important, but we need more than that to actually really help us understand our risks, but also to help us understand how we're actually implementing safety and whether that's actually working. So take a strategic approach to the collection and use of that data. Make sure you understand that results-based framework. That pyramid is, again, one of the most important frameworks in road safety, but one of the least understood. Certainly recommend taking a look at that document on conducting road safety data reviews. It's not aimed for Australia, but it's useful for Australia. It outlines some good tools and steps that you might take to assess where you are and what could change. But also build capacity. Don't expect people to know all these processes. It's not necessarily intuitive, but there's good experience from around the world which we can point towards and upskill. And then lastly, keep your eyes open for these new sources of data. Much of this is already available. There's work being done now to confirm the validity and use of this data. Perhaps Amir might tell us a bit later on some new work he's doing around the use of telematics data for speed, for instance. But I'll finish up there and look forward to questions in the chat and the discussion at the end. Thanks, Amir.
Thank you very much, Blair. That was an excellent presentation, very insightful. And yeah, there are some sort of conversations going on in the chat. Please feel free to just join them if there is any feedback or comment you have, or there are questions for you. And we will have the question and answer at the end of the session. So let's go to the second presentation. Our second presenter is Professor Stuart Newstead. So let me do the appropriate introduction to Stuart. So he's going to talk about integration of road safety data to facilitate high quality research. Stuart Newstead is professor and director of Monash University Accident Research Center, where he also leads the center's injury analysis and data team. He holds a PhD in applied statistics and is accredited by the Australian Statistical Society. He has developed a specific expertise in a wide range of safety research areas with a numerical focus including safety program evaluation, vehicle safety evaluation, monitoring and policy setting, policy enforcement programs including policy and practice advice, vulnerable and high-risk road user safety and countermeasures, safety strategy modeling, injury data systems design and analysis, and injury severity metrics. He has co-authored over 400 works, with more than 160 of those in the peer-reviewed literature. Stuart, hand it over to you to start your presentation, please.
Thank you for that introduction, Amir. Just get my presentation happening. Excellent. Hope that's all working for everyone. So no need to do the introduction because Amir's just done that for me. I feel like a bit of a messenger today because a lot of what I'll be presenting is actually work done by my excellent colleagues, particularly Professor Max Cameron, who I know is online today, and his thinking about data frameworks and particularly risk frameworks for road safety data. And that has been built upon by my colleague, Dr. Angelo D'Elia, who actually completed a thesis talking about data conceptual frameworks and their value and use across many safety domains. And I'd certainly recommend Angelo's thesis to you, which you can see a picture of here and can be actually obtained through the Monash University thesis repository, because it gives you a lot of detail about all the background thinking that has gone into the framework I'm about to talk about now, and so much more than I can actually give you today. One of the things when we talk about data is, why do we collect data? Blair's actually given us a great introduction to why road safety data is important. When we get down to the details of why we're actually collecting data, and data is not collected just for the purpose of collecting data, it's collected because we want to actually develop high quality evidence from that data. And to do that, we have to think about, well, what is the evidence we're trying to develop? And how do we need to think about the data requirements that will actually serve to develop that evidence? And to do that, one of the things we really need to do is actually consider a data framework, because data is, as Blair has pointed out, often very expensive and time-consuming to collect. It can have things like privacy implications in collecting that data and managing its use. So when we collect data, we want to have a purpose for that collection and a reason that we can actually point to for having that data. And if we think about developing a framework, it not only helps us justifying what we do, it helps us identify, well, where are the gaps in the data we are currently collecting? And if we did collect that, what could we do with that data? It helps us justify the ongoing collection of the data we already do collect and how we can actually understand how that contributes to knowledge generation. And as is part of the focus of this presentation, if we actually manage to link some of that data together, what additional value can we get out of that in addressing the sort of problems that we want to address? And by doing that, we can understand the process of risk and how risk is impacted by both the programs we put in place in road safety, but all sorts of other external circumstances too, because obviously our aim in road safety is to try and drive that risk down in the system, and data informing an understanding of how we're addressing that risk and what impacts that risk is really important. So the first thing I'll do is try and introduce a framework. Now, our comprehensive framework is actually, and the one that sort of Max started and Angelo has helped develop, is really driven by a couple of four key concepts that we see often in road safety, and they are listed there. And I'll go through them one by one and explain that. So one of the first frameworks for data or consideration of road safety is actually the Haddon's Matrix. It's been around for a very long time, but it's actually fundamental for informing our thinking around road safety and how we compartmentalize that. And so Haddon introduced the concept of, firstly, phases of road safety thought. And they are what happens before a crash happens. So what are the build-up events to a crash? Then we have the event phase, so what is actually happening as that crash is taking place. And then we have the post-event phase, which is about what happens after the crash has happened in terms of response and recovery. And it talks about the factors influencing those phases, and they are, of course, the human who is involved in the process, who we're trying to protect from injury. We talk about the agent, which is, in this case, road safety. It is the vehicle or the other energy sources around that cause the injury itself to happen. And then there's the environment itself, which is the things like the road condition, the lights, the socio and legal factors that actually sit around the crash. So a really important concept that started us thinking more systematically about road safety and consequently the data we need to inform that. The work that Max Cameron did as part of his, that's documented in his PhD thesis particularly and has been demonstrated in a large range of the work he has done, is actually expanding those event phases out that Haddon has described to say within that there's actually a series of processes that happen. So in our pre-event phase, we can say an entity exists. So people exist, vehicle exists, roads exist. We then go to the idea that that entity is eligible for use in the road system. That entity is then used, energy is built up, hazardous situations occur, and ultimately in circumstances they lead to crash involvement. And through defining that process, it actually defines the sort of risks we often see in public health research. So in road safety, we talk about a public health risk. So what is the number of crashes per head of population that exists? We have a transport risk. So what is the crash risk per kilometre of vehicle travel that we see? And of course, other risks in there can be defined too, almost between any elements of that chain. And it's really important to start thinking about those risks because when we are talking about improving road safety, managing risk is about where do we address the risks in this chain of events, if you like, to most effectively address the road safety problem. Do we stop entities from using the road? Do we limit energy buildup, for example, through speed management? Do we reduce exposure to hazards, for example, by taking pedestrians from crossing roads at grade or getting rid of at-grade intersections? So that chain helps us think about where we address those risks most effectively. Again, similar expansion of the event phase in Haddon can be made to talk about where we have a crash, energy is dissipated and transferred to the people, they become injured, that can become a serious injury or a death. And again, we can define a whole range of risks underneath that and think about, well, what risk are we trying to address with our road safety countermeasures? And finally, we have the post-event phase, which is about crashes occurred. How do we respond to that? What is the recovery process? And how does that lead to long-term disability or death, early death in the ultimate, or back in the previous phase, immediate death? So all these are really important risks to think about when we think about collecting data. I don't need to introduce this slide because Blair's just done a fantastic job of talking about why this is in such an important concept. And so I won't dwell on that more because I think Blair just gave you an excellent explanation, but it's really about from having organisations which achieve things which have impact and measuring that at each stage of that pyramid. And I think what in the Haddon's phases of people, agents and environments, the safe system is actually a great adjunct to that. And many of you have seen obviously the safe system concept because it talks about where all those entities exist in a safe system framework. And I think to a large degree that replaces that dimension of Haddon's matrix in a more systematic thought process. So these are our concepts. So now how do we actually put this together into a framework? And I think it actually melds quite neatly because essentially we think about our road trauma chain. We think about, in the safe system sense, how the elements of the safe system exist in that road trauma chain. And we then think about that target hierarchy matrix is about how what we do to that chain of events in terms of our programs, so the outputs, and how the institutional management function affects those outputs, and how they then ultimately, by changing the risks in that chain, change our outcomes. So whether they be intermediate outcomes, final outcomes, and ultimately social costs to achieve the results that we're looking for. And so by overlaying those concepts together, you can see we'll start to think about how to collect data across that network. So we might be saying, okay, we're thinking about putting in a speed camera program. What are how do we need to organise that through institutional management functions? What are the outputs we get from that program? So we have speed cameras on the road. Where are they installed? How are they installed? How many hours they used essentially? What are we targeting within that in terms of our risk management? Well, it might affect road use because we might, through that, find people and get them off the road. We might be having better compliance with speed, so it impacts energy buildup. It might take away people's exposure to hazards through better speed management and ultimately impact crash involvement. And we'll get to some more concrete examples later on of how we think about this. But it starts to think about, if we collect data on outputs from programs, what will that allow us to relate it to in our road trauma chain? But even in that chain, what do we need to measure? So we need to measure entities existing. So we need to have measures of population. We need to understand what the vehicle population looks like. We need to understand how many of those vehicles are registered for road use, collecting data on that. We need to understand the profile of specifications of those vehicles. We need to be measuring on the road, what are our speeds to map our energy buildup in the system. We need to have data on our hazards and where they exist. And obviously then we need a crash data system to measure when crashes occur. And we need to do it across those dimensions of the safe system. Similarly, in the crash phase itself, or the event phase, we need to have good measures of what the injury severity of people in those crashes are. We need to understand the deaths. We need to understand what it costs society by collecting data around that. So once you understand what that data can bring, you understand how you can articulate elements of this safe system chain and measure what the outputs we have in from our programs and how they affect those outcomes, and in what dimension of that road trauma chain they affect those outcomes. So really important concepts. And in the post-event phase, a similar type of argument. So what does it allow us to do? So what that diagram and our framework allows us to consider really elemental compartments, and they identify what are our final outcomes we measure. What are those intermediate outcomes that Blair just talked about? Where do we need to measure those, and what are they measuring? What are our program outcomes we need to talk about? And so it's obviously really important to consider when we're considering even the concept of a problem or implementing a road safety program against that problem. What is the data we need to understand that problem? What will we need to do to measure its implementation of the program? What will we need to measure to see how that has affected risk in the system and ultimately outcomes against that? So by really compartmentalizing that, we can talk about this as a system and be able to measure that system in the elements that are important, which then allows us to justify, why are we collecting this data? What is it going to allow us to measure? And then we can talk to people about the value in that and why we should invest in that. So it's a really important construct to justify the collection of data and the benefits it will bring. So we don't like to be academics and sit in an ivory tower and say there's a framework, go off and use it. I'll now talk about how that's been operationalised in some of the work that MUAC has done in a couple of projects. First one was a project we're doing. We want to evaluate the effectiveness of vehicle side airbag systems in Australia. So we want to understand how they reduced the severity of injury, and particularly in those areas of the body that it particularly focused on. So airbags, which are curtain airbags, as you see in the picture there, and torso airbags, which are commonly found in most vehicles now. How do they impact the risk of injury to those key body regions that are being protected in that system? So we go to our data conceptual framework. So here is our pre-event phase. We say, okay, firstly, we need to know what is the profile of, so in the safe system here, we're focusing very much on safe vehicles. And we need to know, well, what vehicles are actually on the road? So we say, okay, the data we have available at our disposal is the Victorian Vehicle Register for this study. So we're able to see what vehicles are registered for road use. But when we look at that data, we go, okay, it doesn't tell us which vehicles actually fitted with airbags. So we need to know a bit more about the specification of those vehicles. So we found an additional data set, which is the road vehicle certification system run by the Commonwealth Government, which is now called Rover and has elements of the previous RVCS system integrated. And from that, we can actually see what is the specification, what are the make and models of those vehicles that are fitted. But RVCS doesn't have the specific details of airbag type fitment. So we went to people like Redbook and said, okay, do you have the specifications of vehicles that can be linked on? Yes, they did. They provided us with that data. So we were able to link together that specification data with the model information that came from RVCS and merge that onto the vehicle register. So from that, we could actually see our exposure to a hazard in this case, which is a side impact, and whether that vehicle had that countermeasure for addressing a side impact injury in terms of a side airbag being fitted from that linked data set. We could see from the RVCS system as well, what is the regulation done to delivery of that, so we can actually track fitment over time based on the requirements to comply with ADR 73, for example, and see how that has impacted side airbag fitment over time for compliance with those regulations and programs like NCAP too. So this is where we see our institutional management functions influencing the outcome of fitment of that technology to our vehicles. So that's good. We've actually defined the pre-event phase system, but the key measure we're interested in this study was, of course, what does this do to our risks? So the risks we're trying to measure in this system, given we're involved in a crash, what is the risk we either seriously injured or fatally injured in that crash? So the red arrows there define the key elements of our road trauma chain that we're interested in measuring. And obviously we want a final outcome here, so we want a crash data set. So we went and got the Victorian Road Crash Information System, but realised quickly we're interested in not just injury generally, we're interested in injuries to particular types of the body. So we said, well, that's not contained in RCIS, so how can we augment that? So we went to the TA, said, does your claims injury have that in? Yes, because the claims injury is linked to the hospital admission data in Victoria, which has ICD codes, which can be converted into AIS levels by body region, which can be used to categorise the seriousness of injury to particular body regions that might be of interest in our side airbag study, so we can study very explicit data. So again, a data linkage between hospital admissions, TAC claims, and merging that onto the RCIS data for our crash-involved vehicles can give us a very strong picture about the outcomes from side impact crashes, and how then we can see how does that risk vary for vehicles that are fitted with a side airbag system compared to those who are not. So you can come up with a study design then is very statistically robust and measure the impact of that outcome on what we're trying to achieve. And of course, we're able to do that very effectively. So we look at the reduction in severity to all body regions by the different types of airbags. And we were able to narrow that down to particular body regions of interest that are protected by those airbags and come up with a conclusion. So in this case, combination of torso bags and curtain airbags, fantastic for reducing injury. But we're also able to say, okay, for where there's only a torso bag and no head protection, actually a relatively ineffective system. So obviously our policy implication from that would be we need complementing systems in the vehicle that protect both torso and head together to achieve the results that we're looking at. If you want to know more about that study, that's published in Accident Analysis and Prevention. You can actually see the details of what we did. But the important thing was able to say, what is our objective of the study? What data sources are available and how can we link those together to actually come up with a study design, understanding exactly what we're meant to achieve that outcome. Another example, which is slightly different, is, as I talked about before, let's look at the effectiveness of fixed speed cameras on the road. So we want to do evaluation. What is the impact of those cameras on the risk of crashing and the severity of those crashes? And what does it do to travel speeds at those enforced sites as an intermediate outcome measure? So again, we go back to our framework and say, okay, what are we interested here? So immediately we say, what is the risk? So we're looking at people who use the road and their risk of being involved in crash. So that's our transport risks we talk about there. We need to go back to our target hierarchy matrix. So what is the legislation that supports speed enforcement? How is this program then supporting that regulation in its delivery? Where are the cameras put? How often are they operated? How do they enforce as our sort of program outputs? Our intermediate outcome measure then needs to be speed, and we're obviously interested in the risk of being involved in a crash. So we needed to go to the authorities and that are responsible for these programs, so Department of Justice, and say, well, how have you delivered this program? So there's a sort of program metadata that informs your evaluation design. Where are they? So we can see what is the geographical influence. And when, where, and how were those cameras rolled out as outputs. We can then look at camera data, for example, to measure our intermediate outcome on vehicle speeds. So as a measure of potentially exposure to hazards, our rates of infringement, so how often are people in that hazardous situation, and we can supplement that with things like the Compass IoT data that Blair mentioned, which looks at speeds across the network. So how is it impacting at the site where we're measuring it via the camera, and how is it impacting speed across that broader road network as a general deterrent? And of course, we again use our police reported crash data to measure our final outcomes in the system, our crash involvement. And again, we're more interested in the pre-phase, but we're also interested here in measuring, does it change injury risk? So we have measures of our event phase, and we weren't so interested in very specific injury here, so we took our measures as hospital admission and death as our serious outcome, and we're able to measure our outcomes in that phase. Again, if we had wanted to look at more serious injury, we could have taken that linked hospital admission with TAC claims data to further nuance that measure of risk there. So again, you see, when we do this, when we think systematically, we think, how can we do a well-designed study? What data we have available? Or we might say, okay, to do this study well, we need to collect a different measure of data or an additional piece of data to make that study more complete. And so that justifies then go away and either doing that collection or asking that for collection. And when we think about it across the broader road safety implementation program framework, we can often then start to see where are things that are often missing. And for example, in this event, the pre-event phase here, we're often missing very good exposure data. So the things that Blair just talked about, how to collect that more efficiently using technology is a discussion we can make. So how do we understand what vehicles are using which bit of the road network? Where are they exposed to hazards? And start building up that picture within this framework. Within the event phase, we often say, well, what is the definition of serious injury? How can we improve that? So again, it talks to these measurement of risks in this framework and how they will inform good evidence to then drive future road safety performance. Here I've talked about evaluation studies, but the information is equally as beneficial for problem identification as well, and considering policy options on where do we break this chain most efficiently to get the outcomes we're looking from. So if we're trying to prevent death and serious injury, do we prevent the crash? If we can't prevent the crash, how do we manage energy dissipation in that crash through technology? Or do we go to the pre-crash phase and say, how can we stop this happening? Is it by limiting access? Is it by reducing our exposure to hazards? And then across that, what institutional functions do we need? How do we measure the outputs of that? And how do we measure the impact of that on those final outcomes? So it's a quick Cook's tour. I will end there and hand back to our next presenter. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It was an excellent presentation. So it was very nice to hear about the data framework that was developed by Max and also your other colleague Angelo, and also a practical application of that one. That was very, very insightful. Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next presenter. Our next presenter is Mr. Ross Gregory. So let me do the introduction for Ross. So Ross is going to present use of connected vehicle data, which was touched by my previous presenters as well, in speed management. Ross Gregory is the speed management specialist for the Department of Transport and Planning in Victoria. He's responsible for speed zoning policy for the state and developing tools and process to assist practitioners in making sound, evidence-based speed management decisions. He has a background in traffic and road safety engineering and public policy development at both state and local government levels. Ross, I would like to hand it over to you to start your presentation, please.
Thank you, Amir. So a little bit of a change of pace. I've heard from Blair and Stuart previously, going into, I guess, the depth of the sort of policy and approach and how to use data and build it up in certain ways. And I'll now focus a bit on sort of the next step. So we have the data now. How do we use it? A tool that we have recently brought up for use in Victoria is the Compass IoT system. So this is, and Blair mentioned it at the start, this is using connected vehicle data to give us insights on across the road network. So this primarily comes from in-vehicle systems, particularly from newer vehicles, and more specifically from about 2019 onwards. And then also from fleet telematics, so that could be across heavy vehicles, or also, many businesses will also have telematics, monitors within their vehicle fleets as well. All that data is anonymized and aggregated, and the estimates for the coverage range between about 1 to 10% of the vehicle network, depending on areas and also which roads are being used, etc. And essentially, the data is only provided where it's statistically significant. So we actually have enough data points to provide a statistically significant result. So you can see in the image there, most roads, you'll have some vehicle data there about average speeds, but there are little spots in individual roads and links where there isn't enough data there, so they're just grayed out. So this Compass IoT data is available to all DTP users, also to all LGA users across the state. So anyone can get access to this system and get these insights. So I'll just delve into a bit more now, the sort of insights that you can get from this system. So the previous slide showed the sort of network-wide view. You can also do a deeper dive on particular routes. So you can essentially select a route within the tool and then get some further insights. So that could be things like average vehicle speeds, 85th percentile vehicle speeds, also the kind of speed bins. So I'm sure many people here, particularly in the practitioner space, would be used to seeing tube count data and seeing the data being presented in this way of having average speed, 85th percentile speed, those sort of speed bins. So work has been done by the developer of the system, Compass IoT, to be able to provide insights in a way that that people are used to seeing them. But there are some further insights that we can get as well, which are really quite useful. So that top image there is actually a speed profile across that length of the road. So looking back to a traditional tube count system, you would generally put the counter in the mid-block somewhere, get a sense of the free flow speed in the mid-block of a particular length. Whereas this approach, you can actually see what does the profile change across the road. And so this example here is a link between a couple of traffic signals. So you can see that speed sort of comes up and down as you come within proximity of the traffic signals there. The other measure we can get is also a speed profile during the day. So you could see what effect or what how speeds are changing throughout the day as well. So on this particular route here, sort of around those peak times, you can see that the speeds are dropping. That's probably to be expected in terms of congestion, and a bit higher overnight when there's less traffic around. So that's the sort of speed profile information, but we can also get, and both Stuart and Blair mentioned this as well, sort of G-force data, and which can be indicative of essentially near misses. So that could be either through harsh braking events, or it can be through sharp steering events as well. So here's a image of the kind of center of Frankston here. You can see some clusters of of those dots sort of in some various points around, around sort of a number of intersections, or, in some cases, sort of individual points. So yeah, this is indicative of harsh braking events. So very useful for practitioners to be able to identify where particular areas of risk might be for further investigation. And then you can take that forward to, whether that's through, sort of a black spot type program, or some of those sorts of programs. So an example of how it might be used in practice. So the data is already regularly used by DTP and LGA users. So we, as part of our usual business, we're often conducting speed zoning assessments. Here's a recent example of a section of Bendigo Meldon Road, so out sort of in the sort of northwest of the state. So this is a section of road. I've got an image there showing what it looks like. So pretty narrow seal, gravel shoulders, very heavily tree lined. So fairly typical of a lot of roads across the state where we do have elevated risks. And in this particular case, we'd received feedback from Victoria Police that are recommending a lower speed limit, in this case from 100 down to 80 kilometres an hour be considered. So officers were able to get a sense of the speed profile of the road, and as we can see here, it is pretty high. So the average speed is around 84 k's an hour, with an 85th percentile speed of right on that 100 k an hour speed limit. So that one indicates the speed profile is pretty high and probably contributing to that crash risk. But also, in terms of implementation, we know that this will be a pretty significant change for the local community in that area, because they're used to traveling at pretty close to the 100 k an hour speed limit. So that helps us then in terms of post making the decision to approve the speed change, that it helps to inform our communications and engagement approach around that change. To perhaps we need a bit of extra support here than if it was an example where the speed profile was closer to the existing speed. Just another thing that we are beginning now to use with Compass IoT is using it now for evaluation purposes. Some on the call might be aware that the City of Mildura has conducted a trial of 30 km/h speed limits in the CBD of Mildura, and we've partnered with Compass IoT and also EMEA as well, who's hosting today's event, to work on putting together a dashboard to help us with that evaluation. So the trial was implemented in April 2023, and I've just got a sort of before and after shot here, and just across the top, we've developed, these are interim results, but the interim results are showing that a clear change in average travel speeds across those two roads. So prior to the implementation of the trial, an average speed of 18 kilometers an hour. That's across the entire road network. That's not strictly a mid-block speed. So yes, it appears low because when you're used to seeing it from a tube count perspective. And then the 85th percentile speed is around that 30 k's an hour. The other insight that we're able to get is also the percentage of trips, or the percentage of trips that are below certain threshold speeds. So that T1 there is 30 k's an hour, T2 is 40, and then T3 is 50 k's an hour. And then when looking at the after trial, so we can see the average speed has dropped basically 1 whole kilometre an hour down to 17.3. Really, but of more significance is that 85th percentile speed has dropped quite a lot down to, sort of 3.5 k's an hour. And those percentage exceeding those particular thresholds has dropped quite substantially. So a 10 10% drop in vehicles above 30 k's an hour, you know, another 6 or so percent drop below 40, and virtually no trips, no one's traveling above 50 k's an hour on that network now. Some further insights is that we can get then sort of a histogram of where the speed profile is. So, you know, in this particular case, you know, reflecting the previous graph is, you know, you got that real sort of peak around that sort of 17 k an hour, 18 k an hour range. And some further and the other insights we're able to get is around harsh braking. So we could see before the trial, you know, relatively high, or, you know, about 13% sort of rate of heavy braking. And then that's dropping down to around 7%. So nearly halving the rate of heavy braking sort of events, you know, following the trial, which is indicative of, you know, those near misses that I was talking about earlier on in the presentation. So, yeah, really useful tool to be able to get, you know, obviously the speed profiles, and be able to get that data relatively quickly without having to do tube counts, and being able to see a network-wide view. Again, that limitation of tube counts being generally mid-block only. But you also get those additional insights around heavy braking events. So this dashboard is in draft view. We are a little bit more to go to finalize it, and we're hoping to get a few more insights around risk of fatal and serious injury crashes as well, which we're going to build into it. Just one final thing to that I wanted to cover off was around then other ways we can combine that data with other data sources to help our work within DTP. So it's pretty. This is a tool that we've developed where we're combining the speed data. So I'll just highlight this one road here of Currumbara-Warrigal Road. So we're combining a range of sources here. We have star rating, so that's the OSRAP star rating, infrastructure risk rating score as well as obviously the crash history on that particular road, and those speed insights. So the purpose of this tool here is to help us as practitioners identify roads that might be suitable for a speed management solution. And just to delve into that Currumbara-Warrigal Road example a bit further. So, you know, this is a road that did have a pretty significant crash history, 3 serious injuries, another 4 other injuries. That's in about a 10k stretch, so that's pretty high. That is, you know, that would be putting it into the upper range of crash risk, or sorry, of demonstrated crash history. And as I mentioned, it does have that high infrastructure risk rating score. Yeah, so obviously those two sort of elements together. And in this case, we found that the speed profile was actually pretty close to an 80 k an hour speed limit anyway, particularly the mean speed. So contrasting with the example before, where we found that speed profile was quite high and significantly above the recommended speed limit. In this case, we're finding that it's quite close to it, which indicates to us that there's probably going to be fairly low resistance to changing that speed limit to 80 k's an hour. And as you can see, we have actually recently changed the speed limit on this stretch of road, and that's obviously just an image of what it looks like. Again, that narrow seal, grass shoulders, you know, a lot of trees and things next to the edge of the road. Also, in this case, there is some low-level residential development, sort of low-density residential development across sections of the road as well, as you can sort of see in the background. So that's just an indication of how we can build up a range of tools to help us with speed zoning decisions. And yeah, that was the last sort of slide I wanted to go through. So I'll hand back to Amir now.
Thank you, Ross. That was another excellent presentation. It's always great to see these practical applications that you showcase today to just, you know, indicate how new type of data could be used in order to improve road safety in the road network. Thank you very much for that one. Okay, let's go to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Miss Nicola Fotheringham. So let me bring up the information to introduce Nicola. Miss Nicola Fotheringham. The title of Nicola's presentation is Road Safety in Victoria, Transparent Data, Smarter Road Safety Decisions. Nicola Fotheringham is the Director of Road Safety Strategy and Systems, where she leads road safety strategy and investment planning, road safety data, insights and evaluations, safer roads and speeds, and vehicle safety and technology at the Department of Transport and Planning in Victoria. She brings extensive experience in road safety and personal safety, having successfully led the development and delivery of a wide range of different strategies, policies, projects, and programs. Nicola has also provided expert advice on a wide range of key strategic and policy matters across the Victorian public sector. I would like to hand it over to you, Nicola, to start your presentation, please.
Thank you, Amir. And just give me a tick while I get the screen up.
Sure. So while Nicola sharing her screen, so Ross, there are a few comments and questions in the chat box if you have time to have a look and respond if you can. Otherwise, we can discuss it in the question and answer session. Okay.
All right, is that working?
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful, great. All right, thank you for having me here today. It's a fantastic opportunity. Probably a bit of a change of tune again from the earlier presenters. Today, what I wanted to talk about is how Road Safety Victoria is using data to drive smarter, more transparent decisions, both within government and in partnership with local councils and the broader road safety community as well. Just give me a tick because I've just stepped up my view. This includes the release of open data crash sets, new crash dashboards and mapping tools that we've developed, tailored reporting such as our recently released annual road trauma reports, and fact sheets designed specifically to help local governments plan, prioritise and advocate more effectively. I'll also touch on some of the internal dashboards which Ross has just referred to and that we use to support policy development, infrastructure planning and investment across the network. And all of this really helps come together to inform our approach to working towards our 2050 vision of zero deaths and injuries. So first, I just want to start, hang on, sorry, I'm just struggling with the view here, with an overview of our open crash data, which is available on both the Victorian, sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of this, Open Data Portal and Transport Victoria Victorian Government Open Data Portal and the Transport Victoria Open Data Portal. The data set includes all fatal and injury crashes on Victorian roads as reported by Victoria Police. It covers data from the 1st of January 2012 to present, and it's updated monthly with a 7-month lag to allow for validation and accuracy checks. Some of the key attributes of these data sets include road user type, vehicle type, injury severity, crash time, location, weather, and light condition. The data is available as CSV data files and is presented across multiple tables, which enables people to join and connect information in the way that best suits them. It is one of the most accessed data sets across government open data platforms, and in July this year alone, it received over 1,200 unique visitors with an average of 38 visits per day. This data supports researchers analysing crash trends, local councils planning safer road infrastructure, and community groups advocating for safety improvements. It also enables broad transparency and evidence-based road safety analysis. And I've got the link there for anyone that hasn't come across this one before. As part of the open data, and you'll find it at the same web location, we've also created a dashboard and mapping tool to make it easier to use and analyse the data we have made available. These new functions were released in late 2024, and there's two key ones. So first of all, the crash stats dashboard, which enables interactive visualisation of our open crash data. It also covers the same time period from 2012 to present, and users can explore crash patterns by time of day, day of week, crash type, environmental and road conditions, and road user categories such as pedestrians or cyclists. We've also created a mapping tool, which you can see on the right, which visualizes the spatial distribution of crashes across Victoria. This tool supports crash type and site-specific investigations. It allows non-technical users to easily put together queries, extract tables, and view or download results. We've found this being particularly popular among local government officers, university researchers, consultants preparing road safety solutions, and community stakeholders seeking greater insights. In addition to our open data, I'm really excited to share that earlier this week we released our new annual road trauma reports. So this is really another key step in improving transparency of our crash data and making the data easier for everyone to access and understand. So you'll now find on our website 2 reports providing statistical summaries for 2023 and 2024. These reports provide an annual analysis of fatalities, serious injuries, and MACE 3+ injuries from across Victoria. And the 2024 release includes fatal crashes from the 2024 calendar year, serious injuries from the 23 to 24 financial year, and a 10-year historical comparison. The data has been sourced from Victoria Police and enhanced by the TAC, and it was then reviewed and compiled by DTP to create public-facing statistical summaries. The reports also provide some additional insights that aren't otherwise available in our dashboards or open data sets. This includes licensing and registration data, drug and alcohol presence, for example, in fatal and seriously injured drivers and riders, and MACE 3+ injury statistics as well. These reports build on RSV's open data release by making road safety data easier to access and understand, and addressing previous recommendations that have been made in parliamentary inquiries and alike to increase the transparency of our data sets. They also will support practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and the Victorian community to better understand road safety trends and inform the development of strategies, policies, and interventions. Another key tool we've developed is to support local councils to better understand the trauma in their LGA. So on the screen, you can see some examples of our local government area road trauma fact sheets. These fact sheets have been developed to provide an overview of road trauma for each local government area. All of the 79 LGAs within Victoria have been provided access to utilise these fact sheets, which provide crash data and compare that LGA against similar LGAs or peers. The scorecard that they receive includes data on total fatalities and serious injuries, fatal and serious injuries per year and per 100,000 population, collective network risk, which highlights their system level exposure, and provides rankings versus peer LGAs such as metro or regional city, and a colour-coded scale from much better to average or much worse to average for each of those rankings. It also includes spatial visualizations which support high-risk location identification. There's also a detailed breakdown page which allows cross-comparison of LGAs within peer groups and detection of high-risk outlier LGAs as well. So this one's been a really valuable tool for local governments, planners and consultants to identify high-risk areas, set priorities and monitor their road safety performance. One of the other things we've started to do is to monitor the short-term outcome of some of our investments. And an example on screen shows how we're monitoring short-term crash outcomes for some of our federally funded safety programs. These tools have been developed to help us track the delivery and effectiveness of projects funded under the Commonwealth Road Safety Program. They link crash outcomes with project locations and specific treatment types. This approach allows us to get early insights into whether treatments are producing expected safety improvements. They're updated regularly using the latest verified crash data, and we're using these tools to support us in reporting and meeting our Commonwealth and state reporting obligations, to refine our funding strategies and to increase transparency and accountability of project effectiveness. The tool's also been used internally by our policy teams to provide early indicators of safety benefits. And you can see on this screen just some of the early outcomes that we're seeing for effectiveness of different treatment types. And I note here that these are not true evaluations, it's really preliminary monitoring only, as we do not have sufficient data post-installation for a proper evaluation at this point in time. But the results are looking promising, with preliminary monitoring suggesting a 34% reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes at treated intersections, and a 23% reduction in fatal and serious injury crashes at treated mid-block locations. These insights can help provide critical short-term feedback on which investments are having the greatest impact and inform future investment decisions at the same time. We're also using integrated data sets and mapping tools to help guide statewide and local planning. To support this, we've developed internal tools that help integrate road crash history, road function and hierarchy, and land use, traffic volumes, and speed limits. These tools enable risk-based planning across Victoria's road network. They can be used to support end-state network safety planning, council-led prioritisation of local black spots, and development of funding submissions and business cases. These tools also aid in building a shared understanding of risk between state and local governments. We've tried these tools with a small number of councils and received highly positive feedback, particularly on investment tools practicality. And finally, within Road Safety Victoria, and as Ross alluded to before, we maintain a range of dashboards and models that we've developed for internal planning purposes. These tools combine crash data with exposure metrics such as traffic volume, population, road length, and road network data, including classification and infrastructure types. Some of the different applications include network-wide risk profiling and prioritization, cost-benefit targeting of location-specific treatments, forecasting and scenario testing for road safety programs. And we've used some of these tools to help identify corridors with rising crash rates, prioritize routes for low-cost, high-impact treatments such as shoulder sealing and compact roundabouts, and evaluating the systemic impacts of speed management policy changes. These tools ensure that our decision-making is grounded in consistent data-driven analysis and supports us to have a more targeted, transparent, and accountable investment process. So as you can see, there's been an immense amount of work done behind the scenes and continues to be done to develop a range of tools that combine crash and contextual data to enable smarter data-driven interventions and strategic planning, from network-wide analysis to location-specific treatment design. And I'd like to finish with a massive thank you to everyone who's contributed to creating all of these dashboards and tools, many of whom are on this call today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. That was a fantastic presentation. It's great to see what sort of insights and information are available in the publicly available data in Victoria, and also the type of dashboards and tools that the Road Safety Victoria and Department of Transplant Planning you develop in order to facilitate monitoring, evaluation, and development. Thank you for sharing that information. Okay, so now we have around 35 minutes to 40 minutes in order to do our question and answer session. So we had 4 excellent presentations. So we have presenters across industry, academia, and also great use cases from the government, the state government, and also local government that Ross presented, that you saw here today. So I would like to start the Q&A session now. Before we start, I would like to let you know the way that, again, remind you how we just get the questions. Please, if you have any question, please raise your hand. So we will go based on first come, first serve basis. If I can manage it through Zoom, so I don't have lots of experience with Zoom, doing the meetings inside Zoom, but I'm sure that would be manageable. And also, there are a few questions I saw in the chat box, which we will go to them if there is no question, there is no hand raised. Okay, so now we have Hafez Alawi started. Hafez, could you please start your question? And please mention who is that your question for, who you target. That's the whole panel or just a particular person in the panel?
100%, and I know that I'm opening a deluge of questions, so usually the first one is the most difficult one. So my question is also in the chat room, and it's for Ross, and it's about the Compass IoT data, and it's about the validation of data in terms of accuracy and coverage. And by that, I mean, this is an amazing tool, and it's wonderful, but also for us to be really sure to use it, confident to use it, we want to make this validated. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question. Ross?
Yeah, thanks, Fez. Perhaps I didn't emphasize it strongly enough in the presentation, but with regard to that evaluation dashboard, we are in an interim phase, and there is some validation that we are undertaking and referencing that against tube count data in that Mildura example. But to answer that more broadly, we we have done some work, and I know I've seen Ashim, who I know has done some work in this space as well, was on the call. So as a general rule, it can be compared well within, before and after within that particular methodology. And this goes for all speed methodologies, but comparing one of those across to a different type. So for example, comparing tube data to Compass IoT data, is fraught, or comparing, origin destination data with tube data. Again, no, they're not really compatible. The methodologies are different and you will get different results, but comparing within that methodology. So the example that I gave there of before and after within, using that connected vehicle data, what we've seen is, that is accurate enough to within a as a general rule, within a statistically significant sort of sample, to be able to say, before we've got this profile, and then afterwards we've got this profile. And so that example there in Mildura, we had about 30 odd thousand sort of individual data points before and after. So that's quite a significant sample size to be able to get a reasonable a reasonable comparison. But as I mentioned, we are, that is still interim results, and we are doing some work just to validate that against tube count data as well.
Next.
Thank you, Ross and Fez. And okay, so I don't see anyone else raising their hand in order to ask questions. So I ask a question from panel to just warm up this discussion. Then I will come to you, Julia, and for your question. So I have a question to the whole panel, which is a maybe general question. You made fantastic presentations, and it was very, very informative for me. Looking ahead, what do you see as the most important step we need to take to ensure data and insights are used more effectively, generally, and to eliminate deaths and serious injuries on the road network? So this next step could be across government, industry, or the academia. So I would like to maybe start with you, Blair, to provide your feedback on that.
Yeah, good question. Look, there are some gaps and some next steps. I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're not quite together yet in terms of that performance management process. So being a bit more strategic about the data we collect, and using that to firstly to set targets, but then to monitor our progress towards targets. Because if we don't do that, we sort of wander a little bit aimlessly, and we sort of wonder why things aren't going as well as we'd hope. So there's good progress on this, I'd have to say, but there's still quite a few gaps in most jurisdictions at federal level and at state level. And then, how does local government then link to that? What's their role in the space? They need to be aware of what's expected of them and the targets as well. So a little bit more structure around how we plan the collection of data, the analysis and use of that data, particularly around that performance tracking type process.
Great, thanks, Blair. Stuart?
Well, where do you begin? When we looked at our data frameworks, one of the areas that was really been neglected is that pre-event phase. Now, it's great to hear Ross and Nicola both talk about how that is being filled in. I guess that from research perspective, it's nice to have dashboards, but also having access to research for some of the more granular data that sits under that, to be able to use that would be incredibly useful, so we can relate it to the sort of different bits of the chain would be fantastic. I think one of the things often that is missed is an area of measuring institutional outputs and the metadata that sits above that, so you can do very good evaluation. I think there's a real lack of consideration of what needs to be collected, and I think that needs to be considered at the implementation or even project conception or program conception phase, because often you're trying to fill in those gaps going back, and often you find that data is being collected for administrative type purposes, but it's not really thought about in the context of gathering the evidence we need in terms of evaluation and monitoring at the level that we need to. in our vehicle safety domain, one of the things that frustrates me enormously, and particularly when it comes to our more problematic vehicle types like heavy vehicles and motorcycles, is the lack of information we have around vehicle specification in this country. It's bad enough for light vehicles, but at least the industry seems to keep a reasonable tab on that. There's more we could do by mandating things like reporting of vehicle specifications at the Commonwealth level when they do the certification. That would be a real huge benefit. But at the moment, particularly like heavy vehicles and motorcycles, we just know nothing about what that fleet looks like, and it's very difficult to collect any information on it. So that's an area that really needs to be put in. And often that data exists in someone's database, but the mandate for reporting it and the structures for reporting it just don't exist. The other conversation that really needs to be settled is coming up with standardized measures across the country of what serious injury means and how we measure that. We've got OIS as a measure, we have ISIS as a measure in other spaces, but we just don't have a consensus on what that should look like. And then the structures, both with coordinating with the health data system to connect into the road safety data system to get the level of information we need in that space to do really good detailed work. And of course, the other thing that's obviously missing is a coordinated national in-depth data system so we can actually start filling in many of those boxes at the level we need to. It's done very piecemeal in different jurisdictions, but having something like a FARS and a NAS system in this country and coordinated in-depth data beyond that would be a fantastic adjunct to what we do. It's not cheap, but the insights you can get from having that data are just incredible. And at the moment, we skirt around the edge of the problem of not having that level of detail. So that's my initial wish list, but I'm sure others have others too.
Thanks, Stuart. So you just have a good list of gaps in your mind which should be addressed. And yes, and practically that maybe takes a bit of time to just get there in the government and maybe other authorities in order to be able to just release and create those databases and do the data governance thing. Thanks, Stuart, for that feedback. Ross, Nicola, any feedback?
I'm happy to jump in. I'll take a really different approach to Stuart, I think, in that one of the challenges when we work in road safety, it's such a data-rich field. It's very easy to kind of then go and say, but we need more and we've got all these gaps. And like, absolutely we do, but equally we can be overwhelmed by the volume of data, and it can provide a real distraction, I think, for particularly for our decision makers. But you can get caught off kind of going down some rabbit hole, and I think one of the really key things is pulling people back to look at what is the key data you need and for what purpose, and where there are gaps, really prioritizing those so that we put our effort into trying to address the right parts of the problem. And I think often we can get quite overwhelmed by the volume of data as well. So I think probably just can be a real challenge for us sometimes. And we see a lot of demands for oh well, hang on, there's been a lot of fatalities this week, and people wanting us to react in a very short-term way, and we know that's not what we should be doing, and really trying to push back and go, no, but you've got to look at the longer-term trends. That's where we need to focus our efforts and our attention. And I think sometimes the data can be a distraction and create its own challenges for us too.
That's why you need a good framework for assessment and validation of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicola. So, Ross, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, probably a little bit building on Nicola's point, but I think the value that we can do is, there are a lot of data sources available there, and it's about thinking through how we can combine certain different types of data, to give us that sort of higher level insight. So that last dashboard I showed there was bringing together, okay, we've got some crash data, we've got some road risk data, we've got some speed profile data, and those few different sources. And the intent of that was to try to find, okay, what's kind of the low-hanging fruit, I suppose, for roads that we can then apply a speed management or would be appropriate for a speed management solution where we think there'd be relatively little pushback from stakeholders to actually implementing that. So that was sort of the basis for building that up, and that was just one example. But I think to help that sort of problem that Nicola outlined is then try to think, okay, we've got these range of sources. How can we put these together in the most useful way to give us sort of our best bang for our buck?
Great, thank you very much, Ross. So just return back to the audience. Giulio, I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yep, Julia's one.
Giulio, yes.
I want to agree with Stuart, first of all, about the injury information. We have targets on how many serious injuries we want to go down to by 2050, but we really don't know what the serious injuries are right now, because there's such a mismatch in reporting that there's no consistent starting point. But that's a different topic. The thing I wanted to talk about was, or ask, was about exposure data. I think in your in what you mentioned was kilometers traveled, but I didn't see you talk about numbers of vehicles sold and the difference in the market of vehicles sold. So there are more four-wheel drives on the market these days compared to previously. And I know when David Logan spoke at the conference, what would be the safest car if we all had a Mazda 3, same mass, same size, we'd all be better protected. But the situation on the roads is not like that. There are a lot of four-wheel drives, and four-wheel drives are hitting passenger cars, and I think the injury mechanisms are different. But we're still analysing car-to-car crashes as a car-to-car crash. And I know that, Stuart, in your you have the aggressivity ratings, which tries to disentangle that. But I think the crash data is still missing. Does the four-wheel drive have a bull bar? We have a lot of data, but there's still some specific data that we need that is just not there. How do we address this?
Good question, Giulio. Stuart, or I think the academic side of it is for Stuart, but the practical side is for Ross, because that will affect the results of your dashboards as well, Ross, if you do not know the details of the vehicles. So maybe Stuart, will start with you, please.
They're good questions, and obviously the better the data. I talked about the lack of vehicle spec data, but also things like modification, and we have things like engineering certification that we know goes into a database somewhere, but we never get it linked to actually the vehicle register, so we know this vehicle has been raised or had a bull bar fitted or whatever else is relevant to it. So again, you need to go back and say, well, how would we do that efficiently? And I think there are ways to do this efficiently. I mean, the other data that comes to mind as well is things like, when you talk about people, medical review data. I mean, people have had medical reviews and it sits in a database somewhere, but we just never have consistent access to it. So a lot of it is about thinking about what we collect and how it can be efficiently and with respect to access and privacy made available to do good research with, and not just sort of leave it sitting there because it's an administrative data. How can we spend relatively little money to actually make it available for informing what we do? And I think there's a lot of wasted opportunity in the system because people just aren't thinking about, well, what could this actually inform in value? And that's again why I talk about a data framework, is say, let's put it in there and say, how often are people involved in a hazardous situation, which might be they're on some prescription drug, they've got some other medical condition. We know from the limited in-depth data we have that they're becoming particular issues, but we just don't have any information around that at all to inform it. So I think it's being smart as well as investing money about making the best use of what we do have available to put it together. So it's obviously never an easy conversation, because I think often some of these things come down to, well, should we be allowing this data? What are the privacy issues around it? But often we hide behind these thoughts rather than saying, not why can't we, but how can we? And I think that's an important mindset change that needs to go into data to make the system as available as possible in terms of what we can get our hands on. But too often we just know we can't do that because, rather than saying, how can we do this? How can we make that happen without breaching the privacy and ethics requirements that we need to overlay on that? And I think that's an important part of the conversation.
Thank you, Stuart. Ross, from practical point of view, do you want to add any point here?
There's probably not much further I could add beyond what sort of Stuart's answer is there. I mean, now I think, I guess to the central point, it is something we are thinking of, and I guess a little bit to Nicola's point about there is so much data out there, and it's trying to sort of sift out how can we apply those mass differences, and we have started looking at some work in that area, but yeah, it is an important consideration, but yeah, just have another kind of project that we can see what impact that's having from a road safety perspective.
Thank you, Ross. And practically, it's always difficult to get access to the registration data due to the privacy issues, and exploring that data. And I'm not sure whether it would be any solution in the near future in order to get access to this data, because lots of good information will be revealed in order to do research, even practically, to just reveal lots of insights about how things are working. Okay, so any other questions or from the audience? So we have a good mix of audience here. So from people from industry, local government, state government, consulting, academia. Any questions that you have or any feedback?
There's some in the chat, Amir, that I was just looking at. There's one here for Nicola. I'd love to hear about which of your dashboards or data offerings have been most impactful in elected member conversations. Are there some types of data or ways of presentations that have been more well received and understood by elected members?
Thank you, Chris. Great question. And it's something we grapple with all the time, and it kind of goes to my earlier comment around trying to avoid people from being distracted by the things that aren't the big issue. What we're often doing is using the dashboards that I showed, but really trying to highlight what the key issues are, what the key things that we want, senior executives, ministers and the like to really focus on, and really try and draw their attention to that. Otherwise, they do get lost in the kind of array of data and the noise and that, oh, but someone died last week and this happened, which is where we often see commentary running. And yeah, so it's really highlighting what the key things are. So we'll use the dashboards, but we add on to that when we're presenting up to really showcase what the things are that they need to be focusing on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm glad that you are just monitoring the chat box, Chris. So is there anything else in the chat box? Oh, now
Blair's got his hand up now.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up further on that question and one of the other questions in the chat as well, and that's about the most impactful thing that we might do to take things forward into the future. And Ping's question sort of reminded me of this issue as well. I touched on in the presentation the issue about attitude surveys. So this is another source of data which we do collect, but perhaps don't use to full effect. And this includes particularly at local government level. So one of the issues we face is this perception that the public don't want this or that to happen. So examples would be, for instance, speed change. We know when we do engage with communities and explain what we're wanting to do, that we get a very positive response. The experience from Mornington when Ross was there was about 80% support for speed limit change at locations where there was risk. And then after the change, that went up to 85%. So, and then other pieces of work we've done tracking the default speed limit change in Australia from 60 down to 50. There was annual surveys done at federal level in Australia about what people thought about that policy change, and support was okay leading up to the change. 60% support, 65%, and then in the year before it dropped down because a lot of media coverage. The shock jocks on the radios all explaining how this is going to be the end of the world if the speed limits were to drop to 50. But then, in the 1 year period after the change, the support jumped up to 80% to 85%. So I think the biggest thing we could do to improve our effectiveness in road safety is to actually to harness that data and the community sentiment around change. The public aren't stupid. They do know the link between road safety and risk factors, particularly things like speed and poor infrastructure provision and other variables as well. So that'll be high on my wish list, is to actually make better use of that existing data and get that out to media and to decision makers and back to the public as well, because Another fact we picked up on in other research was most people think that others would like to drive faster, for instance, to others around them in their vehicles because they kind of see it happening. But most people, when you ask them, would actually like to be driving slower in risk locations. So there's a sort of mismatch between people's perceptions of what others think in reality. So, again, harnessing this sort of information and using that when we engage with communities and decision makers, I think is a really big gap in terms of how we use our data.
Thank you, Blair. Great point. Great, Hafez.
So this question is potentially for Nicola or Ross or Road Safety Victoria. So we have in this state developed a really good road safety strategy based on backcasting, amazing strategy. We have developed a safety performance indicator framework, great initiative, fantastic. And we have collected lots of data and tool, and as Nicola and Ross mentioned. Isn't it time that we create more accountability and responsibility by having like the annual workshops and conferences on road safety? So similar to what Sweden does in terms of they take all the information and data they have. And the other thing that you have done, which is amazing, and I commend you for it, is the in-depth crash investigations that you are, and fatal crash investigations that you're doing. So I just want to ask, isn't it time for us to run those conferences and create more transparency and accountability?
Thank you, Hafez.
Great question, Hafez. I think it's always one of those really challenging areas, to try and get more transparency and discussion about, how we're going and what else we could do. One of the things I shared with you in that presentation was our annual road trauma reports that we've just managed to get released, which is a massive achievement and has been well over 2 years in the making to get to that point. So it can take a really long time to do, to get what might seem like probably a small win for others, but it's been a huge win to get that sort of data out there and just a bit more accessible so people can see it. I think it would be one of those really interesting things if we could get those conversations happening. I'm not sure that there's appetite for doing that at the moment. I think one of the other big challenges we have at the moment when we talk about road safety is, it's such a complex system and we only have levers that can change some parts of it. And really trying to work out how we can explain well to government. And I know Stuart's been doing a lot of this around Australia recently, trying to get that message about, what all the other driving factors that are influencing road safety that are completely out of our control, but are putting a lot more pressure on our ability to meet our road safety targets as well. We can, you can measure each of them in isolation, but I haven't seen anyone have a good crack at, how do you pull all that together and really try and understand what's going on, because the upward pressure that we're facing is immense whilst we're, doing a lot of work to really try and get road trauma down. It's one of the real challenges, how we convey that to government and make sure that they can see that what we're doing is really beneficial and what they're investing in is the right things at the same time as seeing, the road trauma at the moment, not really going down, certainly not going down or where we want it to go. So it's a really challenging conversation. And I think we need to get better at also explaining all the other pressures that we're facing that are outside of our control as we communicate some of these messages to government, so we can really maintain a lot of credibility with what we're doing and to say, yes, we are on the right path, what we're doing and the strategies, they're right. We're just not doing enough of what we need to do.
That's probably a really good point you make, Nicola, though, is that the externalities are important too. And what we don't do at the moment is coordinate data collection and across government on things that might actually be important across a range of spheres. So what is the mental health state of the population at the moment? What is the economic circumstances and what is driving those and how do they impact? So we can relate some of them together, but we don't do it well enough as a coordinated system across government. I think there's a lot of value that could be actually obtained in doing that as well and understanding what those external pressures look like.
Blair?
Yeah, just agreeing with Hafez in that comment that I think this is one of our big gaps in Australia, and we've seen the huge success from these approaches in Sweden, particularly well documented in Norway and other countries where there are gatherings of experts and stakeholders, and it's a transparent and open exercise. It's not a conflict. It's basically to assess where you are with that performance management process, and then to plan your next steps. And I actually had a conversation on this with the overseas government rep this morning on exactly this point, where how do we go from what we have now, where they were producing a report annually. It was presented, but there's no accountability and no discussion even around that, and a lot of work to understand where they were, but there's no kind of impetus to have any change based on the results from that in-depth evaluation. So, and my comment there this morning was the same as my comment now, and that is that unless we do this, we aren't going to make progress in Australia. We need to make this a high priority. Yes, it could be uncomfortable for some, but it's got to be made the norm for how we actually manage road safety. It's got to be ownership. And look, you have these conversations and you allocate tasks out to the organisations who have the best ability to take those actions forward, despite these externalities. And again, that's what the Swedish approach is. They allocate, or the Norwegian one probably even better. They allocate all of these actions out to some sort of a lead group to take ownership and take it forward. But that doesn't mean that they're the ones that are criticised when things go wrong. It means that they're the ones you go to help them along on this journey. So it's done in coordination and collaboration. So again, that'll be, I agree with Hafez, on my wish list, very high, that approach here in Australia.
And Blair, I want to clarify that, I really identify with Nicola's position, and, Road Safety Victoria, it's not easy to be in that position. At the same time, I really don't want to look that, we're sitting outside and just throwing more curly question at you. We really want to support you. At the same time, we have seen this happening and working. So I just wanted to raise it with you. Thank you, Blair. And
thank you both for the fantastic question and feedback. And thanks, Blair, Stuart, and Nicola for addressing that. Is there any other questions? So if you have any questions, please raise your hand.
There is another question in the chat box. A question for all presenters. What, in your opinion, is the data gap that, if closed, would provide the best bang for buck for road safety outcomes in Victoria and Australia?
Excellent question. So who would like to start?
I answered that one already in terms of my response around those attitude surveys. I think that's the one area I'd say get stuck in and use that data. It's there's international surveys that use Australian data, 1,000 people surveyed every year. We have our own local surveys in most states in Australia. Let's put that to better use. Local governments should be doing these surveys themselves as well, to understand community sentiment and understanding. And we do get pushback a lot around what we need to do in road safety, speed management being the classic example, but there are others, things like barrier use, even roundabouts, and other interventions as well. But when you delve down and explain to people what we're doing and why, and then get their opinions, we know that there's actually very, very strong support, and people actually are willing to make some concession to a 2-second longer journey time per K if speed limits are reduced. So that'll be my highest on that wish list.
Thank you, Blair. Stuart, Nicola, Ross?
Well,
any feedback on it?
Gave a list before, but I think the biggest gain will be from taking the disparate pieces and putting them together in a coordinated way and allowing quality access. I think there's a huge amount we can do with that. We applied our data framework to fire services as well, and we found in that organisation they had literally hundreds of different data sources that collectively could have been incredibly powerful, but none of them were actually linked and related together. So how we put them together to create efficiencies, I think, is a very easy early win.
Thank you, Stuart.
For me, I know Ross talked about speed and really trying to improve our speed data. That's been a huge priority of ours, to really understand what's going on in the network and do it in a far cheaper way as well than what has historically been done. So yeah, that's been something that we're working on, and I think a big win that we're making some great progress on. The other one for me would be around drugs and alcohol, and we're starting to get some data there, but for us, being able to have linked drug and alcohol data, so we've got a much better understanding of what's going on, would be a really powerful data source for us too.
Thank you, Nicola. Ross, any other feedback on this?
Yeah, I think it really is around speed data, and that's, I think, the promise, I suppose, of the connected vehicle data that I was covering in my presentation. So appreciate, and I've seen comments in the chat as well. So the validation is important about that. Just reflecting on Hafez's first question, yeah, if we can be confident that that data is robust, and it's really quite transformative that we can get that data from the whole road network. You know, you don't need to rely on tube count data or other sort of collection methods. We can just get it for virtually any road across the network. And it makes a huge difference.
Thank you, Ross.
I do have a question, and I'm really interested in the comments around, you know, community perception and coordinating how, you know, we can come together and really collaborate from the community to government, like in everything in between. And I'm just, I guess, wondering how, you know, what some of your thoughts are on areas that have really worked, that have brought the community along as part of that discussion and beginning to own some of that process, some of the interventions, that, you know, the directions that we're heading in. I still don't believe that that's been really done very well. And I think there's a lot more kind of voices where we can get that support in bringing the community along, because without them, we're also not going to have the dent in the trauma that we're seeing either. So I'd be really interested to hear about some really good ways that we might be able to do that more effectively.
Excellent question, Chris.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So yeah, first, there's three things, I think. One is the attitude survey information I mentioned earlier. So capturing community sentiment and then replaying that back to the community, but also to decision makers. That's really important. But yeah, today we're talking about data, which is really the science. We're missing the stories. So science and stories together, working side by side to help influence decision makers about the need for change. So that's been very powerful, and there's lots of examples internationally where that's done. I don't believe we're very coordinated in Australia in terms of capturing this bottom-up approach and the individual stories about impacts on people's lives from road trauma. There are some groups, but they're nowhere near as coordinated as we see in, say, Latin America. Even North America is leading on this over and above Australia. So that's really important. The third thing is, though, feeding back the benefits of what we're doing. So we don't tell people how successful our programs can actually be. So, you know, there's this perception that road death and serious injury are byproducts of transport, and it's just accept that it's a byproduct and we can't really solve it. It's too hard. Well, the simple fact is we can. We've got some interventions that are hugely effective, that basically eliminate death and serious injury. And we need to demonstrate to people what those interventions are, why we use them, and how successful we can be. And there's some great examples where we've failed to feed this back to the community. And I speak particularly about the policy change in New Zealand, where the new government came in with a complete lack of awareness about the level of support for their speed change, and the lack of awareness about the success of that program there. And they reversed that policy, and that led to a disastrous outcome that they're facing there now. So not only is it important for making progress in road safety, it's also important that we present this information on effectiveness to stop us going backwards in road safety as well. So that'll be my 3 points.
Thanks, Blair.
Any other feedback from the panel members?
I think just from the perspective of community feedback, you need to be careful that you don't believe you can't do things because the community sentiment's not there to support it. I think you have to be careful to balance the idea that you can change the sentiments, but how you do that most effectively. Because things like enforcement, things like alcohol enforcement, for example, took 2 decades to change people's sentiment and attitudes. So if you looked at that initially and say, oh, no one supports alcohol enforcement, we can't really do that, that would have been a massive failing. So you have to be very careful on how you interpret community sentiment to drive what you do, but it certainly can give you a insight into how brave you will need to be in terms of your programs and politically to get there as well. So I do agree with what Blair said, and this has been said time and time again, even reflecting on things like the VAGO review of the Victorian Speed Camera program. They said the biggest problem is not the program, it's how you actually communicating it to the people. So that has been brought out time and time again, that is an issue, that communications on why you're doing it and the success of when you're doing it needs to be very clear, and with, again, the good evidence and solid evidence behind that is actually very convincing for the population to justify what you're doing. And that will get the politicians on side as well. So a couple of thoughts there.
Excellent points, Stuart. Thank you for those. We just have 2 minutes left, so maybe it's a good time to go to the next part, which is the last part and conclusion of this webinar. Thank you everyone for contribution in the discussions. We had 4 excellent presentations today. So the first 2 we're talking about the international experience and even national experience by Stuart in the data frameworks, talking about lots of requirements that we have in data collection and the data and insights for road safety, and the way we could improve them by just, looking at them systematically, understanding the gaps. A part of that might be beyond the reach, but gives us a direction how to just move towards those sort of achievements in near future. The second part of the webinar was talking about what we can do given the information we already have and what is available to the public in order to utilize, in order to use it, and do evidence-based decision making in what you do for the improving road safety in Victoria and all over Australia and New Zealand. So I would like to appreciate all the presenters for the excellent presentation, for the time and for the discussions that we had at the end, and also the audience for all the great questions, for listening to the presentations and providing their feedback. And that made, for sure, both sides made this webinar quite attractive, and lots of learnings we could get out of this webinar, and hope others would see this webinar the way that I see. And also I would like to thank Chris Harrison, the chair of the Victorian chapter. Also, we have other people behind this, behind this. We have Kathy, Lisa, Sam, Bucky. So all these people work together in order to provide this webinar to you. So they might be in the audience, but just me and Chris just were at the front and just started to facilitate this webinar. So I would like to thank all of them. And also I would like to thank Gemma Bit. So you can see the email address for her on the screen now if you have any questions. So she is the superhero and just make this webinar happen, do all the bookings and do the advertisement and everything. So at the end, so you will receive the feedback form that you will be sent that feedback form through the college or maybe the Victorian chapter, so a part of college. Please provide your feedback. If you have any feedback you don't like a part of the webinar, you will have rooms for improvement. So please don't hesitate to provide your feedback there. So we are doing our best to make these webinars more and more useful for you as our audience. I would like to thank you everyone at the end and hope you have a great weekend and the rest of the day for today. Thank you. Bye.